Welcome back to WAC, also known as Wide Angle Conversations, a visual media podcast hosted by Rosette Simitian and me, Stacey Barron. So today I am joined by Briel Brown, an English PhD student and poet at UC Davis. Briel studies Mormon literature and she also enjoys Baldur's Gate 3. One thing we have in common there.
Yeah.
So Briel has brought to the table a really interesting text, I think. We don't have the physical copy here, but we do have an image of the cover. I mean, I printed it out as well. This is Pretty Boys Are Poisonous, a poetry collection by Megan Fox. Folks may know her from acting roles in Transformers, Jennifer's Body, my personal favorite, Confessions of a Teenage Drama Queen with Lindsay Lohan. Do you remember that movie?
I actually haven't seen it.
Oh man, it was like 2003 or something like. I'm just making up that year. I don't actually know when it was, but yeah, she was like the snotty popular girl, and that was like. It wasn't her. It might have been her first role, or unless Transformers was. It was a super early role, though. Yeah. She is probably also more recently known for her relatively public relationship with Machine Gun Kelly, MGK, a kind of like genre hopping, I guess, sort of like edgy, but in like scare quotes, musical artist. So this book of poetry, Pretty Boys Are Poisonous, it came out in November 2023. I think it just kind of hits the nail on the head with the title and letting readers know what like the subject matter is going to be. It's a collection of poems reflecting on all sorts of things around like romantic love, longing, neglect, anger, and then even some more sensitive topics. So just for viewer or listener discretion, suicidal ideation, miscarriage, emotional and physical abuse. It's also interspersed with some illustrations done by Audrey Kawasaki, a Japanese-American artist based in LA. And in terms of public reception, Pretty Boys Are Poisonous made the New York Times bestseller list, at least for 1 week in November when it came out. Perhaps, or maybe it was on there for longer than that.
I believe it was just a week, yeah.
But it was number 14, not bad. And here I've also just grabbed a snippet of the book's description given by the publisher, Simon & Schuster, from their website. So it reads... Have you seen this, by the way? Or?
I've not,
okay. No. So it reads, Megan Fox showcases her wicked humor throughout a heartbreaking and dark collection of poetry. Over the course of more than 70 poems, Fox chronicles all the ways in which we fit ourselves into the shape of the ones we love, even if it means losing ourselves in the process. And then a little bit further down, Pretty Boys Are Poisonous marks the powerful debut from one of the most well-known women of our time. Turn the page, bite the apple, and sink your teeth into the most deliciously compelling and addictive books you'll read all year. And that was Simon & Schuster, by the way. It wasn't New York Times. But, maybe they would have had similar things to say. So just, have I covered most of it? Because I don't have a ton of background on this, but let me know. Yeah, is there anything you'd kind of want to add to contextualize the book?
I think that you covered most of it. I'm thinking about the rollout of the book and I guess publicity things. I know that Megan Fox has described the book as particularly graphic and violent, and she's kind of gone into conflicts that she's gotten into with her editor, urging her to cut certain things out of the book because they were a bit too jarring for readers or maybe discomforting. But she was very adamant about including everything as she had originally written it. So as graphic, as violent as she had intended.
It's good to have kind of her a little bit of context about how she felt about the sort of the production and publication of the book. So where I think we could start is just for the people watching or listening. Briel, you had floated a number of ideas and texts to talk about on this episode, and you settled here, which yes. So on Megan Fox's poetry book. So I'd like to just start with that opener of why and what interested you about this book, and why did you land on this book in particular? Out of all the other options that you were thinking about just even talking about, why this one? And then I think a superficial question finally that we're all still kind of interested in is, did you like it?
Yeah. So I wish I had a more insightful answer than it being, the most recently released collection of celebrity poetry. But if I force myself to dig a little bit deeper, I think that Megan Fox's current, status in the public eye, her role as MGK's partner, fiance, girlfriend, that combined with the release of this book, I thought was really interesting because much of the book is detailing like abuse and toxic relationship structures, things like that. And you've mentioned that, a lot of these poems are really explicitly about her current partner, Machine Gun Kelly, Colson Baker.
Colson?
Colson Baker. Yes.
They always have such like unassuming names.
Very much so.
Beyond their pseudonyms, yeah. Or, stage names or whatever.
But I think that, I don't know, it's just a little bit jarring to see someone release a collection of poetry that portrays their partner in such a negative light. And I think that that's something that stood out to me about this text, that as I'm reading it, I feel like I'm getting a look into like behind the curtain of this very highly publicized relationship. Like, I think that both of them are more famous for this relationship than they are for any of their work that exists at the moment. So, this collection of poetry is rooted in that fame around the relationship. So this is kind of, I don't know, taking that relationship as it exists in real life and making it into a form of media, like a consumable text. And it just seemed fun to dive into. I had floated, Drake's poetry collection, but I think it was a little bit too Instagram-y to be worth discussion. A lot of the poems are like 3 lines. It's very, very short. And Lana Del Rey's collection and Halsey's collection as well, I kind of floated, but I'd heard a lot more positive responses to like Halsey's collection, and I kind of wanted to be negative. So yeah, after reading it, I don't know, it seems kind of fun to bash celebrity poetry, but after reading it, I think that there were a lot of poems that I really liked. On the whole, I might not read it again, but there were a lot of things where I thought that she had really interesting imagery, or it leads you to interesting conclusions. I had fun with it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, to bring up, like, I actually don't know how recently the other poetry books came out, like Lana Del Rey's, is that what you said? And then Drake's, like, are those all also pretty recent?
Yeah, so I think Lana Del Rey's collection came out in 2023. Halsey's is quite a bit older. I think it may have been like early pandemic, if not before.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is, the most recent.
It does seem like, I wonder, do you think there's something, as a poet, right, and like active in like the poetry like scene, is there something to be said about not just, I mean, obviously Megan Fox's, right, contributions to poetry publications, but like all of these kind of like celebrity or influencer like level of poets that kind of emerge, or this kind of like making of, in order to, right, kind of, I guess, just like branch out, right, into like kind of, I guess it's like other forms of art and expression at a very basic level. But is it like, I wonder, is there just some kind of like trend that you're seeing? Is that a trend, or is it kind of just like, I mean, you mentioned a little bit that like Megan Fox's book in particular is so much about like her relationship with MGK that perhaps like, is there something going on there with like trying to like sort of capitalize on that? Or is it more just like, is there just a kind of upsurge of like poetry and like, people wanting to venture into that a little bit more?
I mean, I can't, know what inspired this collection. I do think that it's, most of the popular poetry today is produced by people who are already famous, right? Like, it's not really produced by people who are poets first, right? And Halsey's and Lana are, musicians, so a lot of what they do is already kind of poetic. It makes sense for them to kind of transition into that. But, Megan Fox is not, a poet prior to the release of this collection, right? She's an actress, an influencer of sorts. Drake is not a poet. I mean, I guess you could call, his songs poetic in some ways, right? It's not a huge jump. There's also a model, Ursa Daly Ward, who is very famous, and she had a poetry collection released recently, and that has sold pretty well. I believe it was published by Penguin, right? So I think that most of the poetry that people would be able to like recognize today or have heard of is poetry created by people who aren't necessarily poets from the jump, right? It's by people who are famous, and they have an opportunity to kind of like dip their toe into this. That's my statement.
Okay. That's my statement. I do think there's, and I wonder like what the connection is also with like, I feel like this came before, but I'm sometimes a little behind on it, so correct me if I'm wrong, but right, like I think you mentioned it too, like this precursory like rise of like Instagram poetry and stuff, which seems to, I feel like, still be a predecessor to like these like poetry books, right? Like I feel like whenever like Rupi Kaur was like big, right? I think that was even like pre-pandemic in some ways. Like I don't know exactly, but yeah, do you think it's following that trend, or and what's going on there?
I feel like it's worth mentioning that like even Rupi Kaur, her online following was not rooted in her poetry, right? She had gone like viral initially for her like undergrad thesis of photography, and she had gained a really big Instagram following off of that, and she started after gaining that following, she started posting line drawings along with poems, and that allowed her to, really capitalize on her like virality and step into the realm of poetry. Now she has an Amazon special where she's doing a reading. She's very successful.
Amazon special.
Yeah, she's got an Amazon Prime special. Her book, if you check her website, it will say that her book has sold more copies than Homer's Iliad. Yeah, she's...
Okay. And that's, I mean, it's fact check.
No, it's true. It's very true.
Yeah. Specifically sold, though, right?
Yeah.
I think the Iliad is circulated in a lot of other ways other than... But anyway, yeah, that's... Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay, so do you want to... I think we talked about maybe starting with, this opening sort of letter to the reader. Yeah. Which I think is... Yeah, I haven't printed that on my own, but I'll pull it up over here. Yeah, it's an interesting... I mean, a dear reader moment, right? Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to read through this or what were your thoughts on?
Yeah. So it's a dear reader letter, and it starts off with, quote, "All of my healers tell me that my throat chakra is blocked. In case you aren't familiar, the throat chakra is the energy center that is related to communication. Usually when someone's throat chakra is closed, it's because they are not able to identify their feelings and articulate them in a way that is aligned with their emotions and intentions." She continues, "I don't have this problem. My problem is that I deeply identify my feelings and have multitudinous ways of articulating them, but I am not able to express them because when I do, it has made the men who have loved me feel intimidated, inadequate, and insecure. And so I have spent all of my life making myself so small that others can feel confident." So that's the note that she starts off on, right? Her urge to kind of shrink herself and her reluctance to communicate is centered around this anxiety around getting negative emotions out of men, right? Which is, the central theme of the book, right? Pretty boys are poisonous. We've got Megan Fox, the speaker in every poem, positioned against men as a force that not only causes harm to her, but also causes like certain self-destructive tendencies, and prevents her from being able to like reach her potential, right? But there are also several points in the book where this kind of struggle between the speaker of the poem and men bringing out self-destructive tendencies of love being very violent is kind of accepted, right? It's accepted as a part of what makes the speakers of the poems who they are and like a necessary aspect of being in love, right? And that's kind of addressed in the first poem of the collection. Let me just look quickly at the Dear Reader just to give a little bit of the notes that she wants to leave the reader with, right? I am at once jaded and naive, a hopelessly romantic open wound of a human with a blisteringly sardonic sense of expression that I keep mostly repressed except for the rare red carpet mouth because I can't bear the weight of the artifice anymore. But then one day it happened. One of said idiots finally broke me, and from me poured these poems featuring previously unspoken feelings of isolation, torment, self-harm, desperation, longing, restlessness, rage, and general anguish. These are the experiences of many of us that I now give voice to in these poems. This book is for anyone who has given much more than they received, or for anyone who struggles to believe they deserve to be heard. This book is also for me, because fuck, I deserve better. Love, Megan. Right, so the central theme of the book being the speaker positioned against, violent men, abusive men, toxic men, things like that. And the book itself is marked as kind of making a statement for oneself and acknowledging the ways that they've been hurt by these men, and the ways that it's harmed them personally, and also extending their response to these situations as a statement for other people, right? So this is a spot where other people can connect and identify with her experience, but also a spot where she can, kind of say enough and have that resonate in place of, people who might not be able to speak for themselves.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting now that you've read through it again. Yeah, that at the end, right, she says this book is also for me. And at the beginning, right, the address is to the reader, but in many ways it could be her, right, like speaking to herself and like being able to kind of self-express and recognize herself like in these, right, in these poems, especially because I think there's an interesting sort of like, I mean, I don't know too much about it, but right, there's a kind of not necessarily what's what I'm looking for. It's like the relationship between the relationship between the narrator, the speaker of the poem, and or poems, and like the actual author, right? Like sometimes there's I think there is often like a technique there, not a technique, but
like a disconnect.
Yeah, or like even like from like a critical perspective to like approach the poems as though, it's the speaker, right, and the narrator that is like projected, through the voice of the actual writer, in this case Megan Fox, but they're not always like one in one, right? It's always like a little bit like a degree removed.
Yeah, so the reader can kind of like position themselves as the speaker in reading. Yeah, I know that for a long period of time, people were very adamant about being like the speaker is not always the author. I think this is kind of rejected in this book, right? These poems are firmly Megan Fox. They are rooted in, pop culture happenings and like references to people who exist in the real world, and people can like easily identify them.
Yeah. Do you want to start with the first poem then?
Yeah. Maybe I'll take a step back real quick because I want to talk about the Grossman a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of the relationship between the reader and the speaker in the poems, right? That Megan Fox is speaking for herself, but also other people speaking on behalf of them and for them. I don't know what the distinction is. I misspoke. But I think that's something that's kind of widely believed in lyric poetry, or the way that some people kind of perceive lyric poetry is that part of what lyric poetry is trying to do is that it's trying its best to kind of breach up against like other consciousnesses. It's trying to like do its best to break that barrier down, right? You can never know what someone else is thinking. But through lyric poetry, we're kind of able to depersonalize a bit and step into other people's perspectives. And that is something that's really crucial to lyric poetry. And I had mentioned like wanting to talk about the Alan Grossman text just a little bit. So there are a couple like axioms from that text. It's the Cited Singer. It's Summa Lyrica, which is in the collection, The Cited Singer. And there are just a couple principles of lyric poetry that he explains in that text. So the first one that I wanted to start off with, which is in this section, immortality. So the function of poetry is to obtain for everybody one kind of success at the limits of the autonomy of the will. The limits of the autonomy of the will discovered in poetry are death and the barriers against access to other consciousnesses, right? So that autonomy of the will is kind of a clunky big phrase, but basically it's just referring to anything that's not poetry, right? So when you write a lyric poem, it's because there's nothing else in the world that you can do that can achieve this goal, right? The only route is to write the poem. And the limits that the poem discovers are death and the barriers against access to other consciousnesses, right? So when you're writing a poem, you're doing your best to imagine a reader and give them an experience that mirrors your own. And that's through metaphor, that's through other kinds of figurative language. And then also with this limit being death, right? People kind of extract from Grossman the idea that a lyric poem, is kind of an exchange between the writer and the poem on the page, right? So the poem as itself is kind of sacrificing the ability to say anything that's not on the page, right? So if there's a sonnet on the page, that's all it's ever going to say. And for that, it gets immortality in return, right? So this poem exists forever, and this is all that it can ever say. So as I was reading through the collection, I was often, wondering to myself, was this really worth immortality? Did you sacrificed your life to say this? Yeah, that was just kind of a refrain that I thought as I was reading through. But as I said, there are a lot of poems that I really liked.
Yeah, and so to be just so I understand. So basically, that's only achievable through like lyric poetry, though.
That's kind of what's assumed in Summa Lyrica.
Yeah. Okay. Which whether that's
Yeah, the poem kind of comes about because there's nothing else that you can do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I guess with that we can launch back into the first poem of the collection.
Yeah, and I do think there's something interesting about the way that the titles of the poems are also at the bottom, right, of the poem. I just think that's interesting. I don't know if that's a popular a popular sort of form now.
It's not actually that popular. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something about, kind of like the surface level stuff of like you read the poem first and then see kind of how the speaker, the narrator, envisions this poem to be kind of in totality, right? Like you don't get the kind of setup of expectations that a title normally gives you at the top, right? It was like a header. First, you just dive directly into like the body of the poem, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think that often like mirrors the reading experience even of poems that like begin with titles. Like I just kind of gloss over the title and I read the poem, and then I might be confused for a second, and then I look back at the title and I'm like, oh, that's what it was about. It kind of like makes things click at the end.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it does seem like titles are almost like invisibilized, but especially in like a book of poetry as well, as opposed to, let's say, like just a book of prose or something like that, where oftentimes like chapters don't even have titles, and they're a little bit less. Yeah, it's almost like because every poem is titled, and it's usually so full, like, right, there's always so many poems oftentimes in like a book, as opposed to like just like chapters in a book of prose, that they almost do kind of like blend into the background. Yeah.
So we can start with the first one. I guess I'll read the title last in line with the text as is. I used to believe love was a poem. Now I know love is a killing spree, the indoctrination of a hopeless romantic. So this is, post the Dear Reader letter, this is the opener of the poem, right? It sets the tone for the work as a whole. So when I kind of think about what's being laid out here, right, we have as the occasion generative of speech, which is kind of what sparks a lyric poem, right? It's the reason why the speaker is talking. The occasion is a realization that they held an incorrect belief in the past, right? And the speaker then has to sit with reality. And that's done in a quick 2 lines in a title, right? So I used to believe love was a poem. Now I know love was a killing spree. If we contrast those two beliefs, right? If we look at love as a poem, I believe that here it's kind of portraying love as something that's picturesque and beautiful and really idyllic. And it flips that to the realization that love is a killing spree, right? So our speaker has to like sit with that and accept it. There's not really any railing of it. It's really just like an understanding that is come to. And I would, if I were to like rephrase this using like a different metaphor, I kind of feel like this is somewhat similar to like the scene of a soldier shipping off to war with a bundle of cookies and then ending up in the trenches 2 weeks later, right? It's not what you thought it was. It's much more violent. Kind of comes to the resolution that this is the space on which we walk, and moves through the poem with that realization, right? That the violence and the, not so picturesque experiences in love are going to be what is the norm throughout this text.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting, right? Yeah, love. It's interesting even just the way metaphor is used here too, as it's not, love is like a poem or was like a poem. It's literally love was it. I used to believe love was a poem. And so the kind of like embodiment of love as a poem, as a certain like art form, as opposed to, right, the second line saying that it's a killing spree, which is still a type of like embodiment and also a type of like disembodiment in some ways if you think about the literal. But it's also more, a killing spree is like this kind of like progressive, right, and like continual. It suggests that it's like a continual thing, right? As opposed to like a poem, which I think a lot of times people see that as a kind of like finite and like enclosed sort of.
Neat.
Yeah. So it's an interesting contrast there too in terms of like form.
Yeah, I think the disembodied thing that you point out is really interesting, right? Because it's not necessarily assigning a party who's doing the killing, right? It's the love in conjunction that ends up being the killing spree. And oftentimes throughout the collection, right, the pretty boys in these poems are the ones who are doing the violence. But we also see an acknowledgement from the speaker that they themselves are playing a role in their own self-destruction. So I think that this poem really recognizes that very neatly.
Yeah, I agree.
We can go straight into fucked up fairy tales. Fairy tales are kind of like a common theme within this book, right? And it is, in line with the thinking love was a poem, right? Prince comes and rescues you. Things like that are kind of how a lot of people are raised, imagining love, relationships, marriage, things like that. And we jump in the second poem to kind of dispelling that. And the fairy tale motifs will like appear throughout the text alongside religious imagery. I think that they're paired together really often and also really well throughout the book. But I can go ahead and read the second text. Okay. Prettiest boy, full of sadness and mischief. Your words are winsome and diaphanous, like the rain that momentarily collects on flower petals. My heart stretches, eager to encapsulate your wounds. Let me heal you. Violent boy, full of rage and insecurities. Your hands are so beautiful and strong. You use them to hurt me now. Delicate bruises splayed across my jaw. I wonder what you are thinking while I cry and beg you to stop. Fucked up fairy tales.
Yeah. It's an interesting, or at least the form in and of itself, between the two stanzas, right, are mirrored in some way, right? There's a duplicity there, of like kind of, in some ways, like two sides of the same coin, perhaps, speaking about the same person, right, the same boy, and the two different kinds of characterizations that have been like externalized about this person.
Yeah, so you point out like the mirroring, which is, apparent in like the form and like the beginnings of each line, right? There's a lot of similar like sentence starters. There's also the pairing, if you look at the last line of each stanza, let me heal you versus I wonder what you were thinking while I cry and beg you to stop. Those two are kind of paired, right? You have the healing and the being the victim of some sort of abuse or just suffering in general, right? Healing is kind of equated with that suffering. And we have kind of like a yearning to endure that kind of suffering, right? Rather than you have the crying and the begging, but internally, right? It's just kind of thinking about the other person's thoughts, right? There's still like concern or care there.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's interesting.
I really like the metaphor in the fourth line, like rain that momentarily collects on flower petals. I thought that was a nice turn of phrase.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah. I like the comparison that you made between the two ending lines of each stanza. Because if you go up, so that's the fifth line of each stanza, then they're both kind of doing this, playing with this sense of, I don't have to bring it back to what we just talked about, but interestingly, it does seem to speak again to like this kind of just the idea of like embodiment, right? And in some ways disembodiment as well, because it's like my heart, right? Your wounds, not necessarily right, like attached to the body in that case. And then also in the second stanza, just delicate bruises splayed across my jaw, right? So it's kind of like very like corporeal like parts of the body that are described here in tandem with one another. And also this kind of like inversion, right? Like my heart stretches eager to encapsulate your wounds being at the end, and then in the mirrored line, the fifth line, delicate bruises, right? So the kind of injuries, right, are sort of inverted from the front to the end. Or read the other way around, really. The end to the front.
I think the embodiment there is like really essential to the poem, right? Because when you talk about like the heart stretching to encapsulate the wounds, right? That's not something that's physically possible. Versus the bruises are very physically possible, right? So you have like the metaphoric version of what's going on in the first stanza, and then it shows you how it, manifests, right? My heart stretches eager to encapsulate your wounds. Throughout the collection, there's a lot of mention of this violence happening as a result of like childhood trauma and things like that, right? And in the heart stretching to encapsulate the wounds, that can be, in some ways letting these things happen, right? Or sitting there and attempting to find forgiveness and things like that, and maybe making excuses, right?
Yeah, I like that you brought up, how like the heart and like the wounds are almost kind of like, those are sort of invisibilized in a lot of ways, the way that that's being talked about, right? Like the heart physically can't do that. It's also like, the heart is kind of just in many ways like metaphorical for like just love in general, right? So something that's totally like intangible. And same as like, right, if we're thinking about wounds in this case being this person's wounds, not the speaker's own, being as a result of like the childhood traumas, right? So wounds that are mostly probably emotional or like even mental or whatever, psychological here, as opposed to the direct contrast of like the bruises splayed across my jaw, right, which are very, very much visibilized, very much like tangible, as opposed to so there's an interesting kind of crossplay between like what's visibilized and what's not in this kind of really violent exchange.
So with the 3 sex poems, I guess, I think that this plays interestingly with the idea, and it's kind of throughout the book, plays kind of interestingly with the idea that like what men want in relationships with women is like sex, because I think that is something that's really not touched on at all. Like Megan Fox doesn't talk about herself being like, there are certain poems, I think it's like Becoming an Accessory, where she talks about being objectified, but there isn't a lot of like eros on the part of men in this book, right? A lot of the poems that deal with desire deal with unfulfilled desire on the part of the speaker. And I think that's kind of interesting, and it comes to play in these 3 poems, All in Circles, I've Always Liked Serpents, and I Would Die for You, oh, JK, LOL. There might be a couple others, but these are just 3 that stuck out to me. So I'll start maybe with, just in chronological order, I'll start with I Would Die for You. Okay. So if Romeo and Juliet had lived long enough, maybe they too would have gotten to the point where Romeo was so numb to her that he would rather read Twitter in bed than fuck. Because there's always tomorrow for that, or maybe the next day or the next. I don't know, he's just so busy now. I still imagine she kills herself in the end, though. Only he doesn't follow. He just signs up for Raya instead.
Which I should have looked, because I remember reading this and I was like, what is Raya? Is it?
It's the celebrity dating app.
Oh, I did not know that.
You have to be like verified and like get like recommended by someone else to join. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So within the first stanza, I did write LMAO next to it. I thought it was funny. I mean, we're dealing with kind of like unfulfilled desire, right? Like just a kind of a stale, dead relationship. And I just think it's interesting that the speaker is the one that's feeling that desire, right? You have throughout the collection a lot of things, like it seems like violence is the only kind of emotion that's directed towards them, right? There's not a lot of like lust on the part of other characters in this book. And when it's from the speaker, it's unfulfilled lust, right? So it's like, and here it's also pointing out the fact that those emotions aren't returned, right? The Romeo in this case doesn't return that kind of sexual attraction, doesn't have the energy for it, things like that. And also we have the only he doesn't follow, he just signs up for Raya instead, right? He's looking for the next person. So he's kind of firmly planted in like internet spaces, right? It's not like he's going to a bar to pick someone up. He's signing up for Raya. So it's kind of like a detachment, right? Like he's not interested in the physical elements of a relationship. He's existing in kind of like a virtual world, even with, Juliet right next to him.
Yeah, I think that's reflected in some of the other poems too, where now that you say that, like some of the ones where she identifies this person, this guy as like something about like, walking red carpets and like it's just kind of like being in the public eye and like being like a public figure, and that being sort of what kind of like just sort of what encapsulates him kind of like as a person, and kind of like the only way that like I guess it is the sense of detachment, right? So it's like the ways in which like he's not reachable because of that like public persona. And like the idea of like public appearances, and especially like ending this with like, now that I know that, ending this with that he signs up for Raya, Yeah. So it's an interesting, yeah, kind of like, yeah, like an internal or at least like, yeah, interior like perspectives or like perceptions of someone as opposed to like, yeah, the external ones, which is a very like kind of like common theme, I guess, when we think about like celebrity culture, right? Like, yeah, the kind of like, you know, how are they received versus like what kinds of, yeah, what is like the idea of like the persona too, which is an interesting kind of like construction really of a person. Yeah.
I think maybe we could like move into the next one and talk about that kind of like persona there. So 57, it's I've always liked serpents. Maybe the apple was actually a cock, and maybe Eve wanted it because Adam was too busy, self-absorbed, and distracted to fuck her. Maybe the original sin was a man taking a woman for granted. So we have, again, like with the was too busy, too self-absorbed, right? We have that kind of concern with perception and like distance between like connection, genuine connection with like actual people, right? He's kind of in his head more so than he is present.
Yeah, an interesting kind of, yeah. So maybe the apple meaning like basically, yeah, the symbol, the material symbol of like, yeah, the original sin, or actually really just like temptation, right?
And I think that this is the poem where I kind of started to like think about sex as a concept within this book and like recognize that it has a really odd tenor here. Just, I don't know, I think it goes against the kind of cultural belief that like men are always wanting to use women for sex. And it seems here like that's not at all happening, right? It seems that they're using women for validation, which is, you know, that oftentimes hides behind desires for sex, right? People will present desires that way, but really they're desiring sex for the purpose of validation. And I think that that is a really nice like insight that she presents here, like recognizing that in the way that people interact with her.
Yeah, that's interesting that you point that out, because I think again it just comes back to this idea of like not just the things we were talking about like, yeah, like public perception and like cultivated personas, but how that is totally like a disembodiment also. And how in some ways, like, yeah, this kind of this bid for like physical connection, but also by extension, it's emotional connection that she's looking for, right? And the way that that's not fulfilled, because that is a very like embodied experience. And so all these things she's kind of searching for, it seems like a material, like tangible connections that are based in like embodiment. And yet everything that she understands this person to be is totally disembodied, right? From like who he, not to say who he like really is, but at least like a disconnect between, how he is presented, right? And presents himself, as opposed to, the kind of physical connection that one could have with someone to like sort of know them, right? So that's really interesting.
Do you think that comes into play at all with like the presence of mythic figures here, right? So these, you know, there are some poems where the speaker is like firmly rooted in an interaction with a named other, but here we have, you know, Adam and Eve and Romeo and Juliet, right?
Sorry, what's the question?
Like that disembodiment, right? And that kind of rejection of like genuine connection, I believe you were like talking it about. Do you think that that is like helped along at all by the like off-putting of these attributes or behaviors onto like mythic figures?
Right. Yeah. I mean, just the idea of, the way that she invokes like mythology and like fairy tales and stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, that's very much, these kinds of forms that I think like traditionally are conceived to be disembodied and at least like immaterial, right? A lot of the ways that we talk about like myth and fairy tale being kind of like, you know, oral, like spoken, like things that don't have material, like originations in some ways. So even in terms of form, I think that it's doing something interesting there to talk about. This kind of, it's not necessarily like a dichotomy between like what is embodied and what isn't, like what's material, what's not, but maybe just more of like it seems like more of a, I don't know if it's really like a spectrum, but really just like a play on like, you know, what embodiment looks like, and whether like embodiment with like kind of like between two people, I guess, or like the bid for embodiment to be physically like recognized and seen is possible, and to what extent. So I think, what do you think about that? About this invocation of like mythology, which is also a very like, I mean, what is that? Hang on, if I can return to the things that I had to know for my prelim. There's a lot of someone might have to help me, and then it's just like a technique that like who the hell were they, like Pound and stuff like that.
Yeah, modernists.
Yeah, high modernism. That's what
Okay.
I mean, right? It's like that's like a thing that like high modernism did in like the 20th century, right? It was like always invoking like
invoking like mythic figures, calling on the muses, something like that.
kind of, yeah, or even just like referencing them, right? And kind of like sort of like displacing them to like a contemporary time. I think that was like a popular thing that, if I remember correctly, like happens with like kind of like high modernist poetry. So in some ways, she's kind of following those footsteps in a lot of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I think about like Adam and Eve being the like primary subjects of this poem, I'm thinking about how heavy that like myth rests in like American society, right? I feel like, every poet has to touch on it eventually. And when I think when she, in the first, couple lines, maybe the apple was actually a cock and maybe Eve wanted it because Adam was too busy, self-absorbed, and distracted to fuck her, right? So we have like explicit desire, right? It's rather than being, the deception of the serpent. We have it being, positioned as an active act and exercise of agency that's prompted by Adam's failures, right? And I don't think that like, the phallic comparison of the apple, right, and the serpent, like that's something that's always been acknowledged. So she's, aware of that here. But in making it explicit, I don't really know at the moment what to say about it, but I think there is something, maybe a little bold about making it explicitly that, right? Rather than just leaning into the like phallic imagery of the serpent, right? She's making it more embodied here than it would be if you were just talking about snakes.
Yeah, it's the apple and it's like, the cock, which both of which you are consumed in some ways also, which does a weird kind of, she's got some like food imagery in here as well, but I do think it's kind of around like consumption too, which I think is interesting because the ways in which like consumption is very much corporeal but also quite intangible also when we think about it in like these like metaphorical ways, or like how one can be consumed by desire, and oftentimes unrequited like desire, which is a lot of this. So it's interesting. Is there a third poem?
Yeah, there's a third we can just talk about a little bit. I think that I think it'll be interesting still in the line with like embodiment, disembodiment.
Okay. Yeah. That's the 61. Okay. Got it.
Karma is the shiver that will run down your spine when you realize that he's fucking me to sleep every night, while all of the lies that you told me haunt you in your dreams, all in circles. So it starts off very embodied, right? And interestingly so, right? So we have a physical sensation, but it's also like taking something intangible, right? Karma as a concept and turning it into that physical sensation. And then when we get to the like realization here, right? It's again, sex being used as like an ego play or something that's like for validation, right? It's not so much that the speaker is even enjoying the sex, right? Like, it's more so that they're using that as a way to like harm the other person's ego here. And I think that the validation aspect is in play there, right? It also, I think I've mentioned that desire for sex is not something that's really positioned on male figures in this text. More so it's the desire to like derive validation from things like that. And I think that's very apparent here, that the sex here and in a very, physical manifestation is something that's haunting him in his dreams rather than something that he's like, it's haunting him in his dreams and making him remember like ways in which he messed up, right? Rather than like a desire for sex itself, it's more so like the wound to his ego to know that like she's with someone else.
That is interesting though, because I do definitely think that is the like interpretation that's meant to be like understood here. But it's interesting because when you were reading it out loud, when we get to the part where, or whatever this is, like the 5th line to the 7th, when you realize that he's fucking me to sleep every night, and there's the enjambment, between like he's fucking me and then next line, to sleep every night. And so it seems like like he's fucking me to sleep, right? Like we're going to sleep, and then also, but it also could be read in
like a cope, right? Like he has to do this to sleep.
Yeah, which is a weird kind of, I don't think that's necessarily what that means, but the way that the line break kind of separates that, like almost makes you want to see it from, like, see both kind of interpretations there. Oh, definitely. Which I don't know what you would do with that, like, because that seems to express actually some kind of desire on the man, right? In this case, or her partner. If he's fucking me in order to go to sleep, right? Like that's, or in order to like right before bed, like it's something he has to do in order to, which doesn't necessarily maybe express desire, but it does express some kind of maybe recognition of I mean, I think it's,
I could go for it being desire, but I think it's also represented negatively, right? Like I think that it hits the same as someone saying that they need like a nightcap to sleep, right? Like this is something, it's like more of a crutch than like something that someone is like actively seeking out or like wanting.
And it's certainly not like a bid for connection.
Yeah, because it's centered, it's not a bid for connection, as you mentioned, because it's so centered around like the third person here, right? You have two people engaged in sex, but, all the while, the third person who's kind of like seething about it is the one who's of primary concern here, right? So the connection is still aimed at like the third person. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then just to, I guess, end with the title, which is how it ends. All in circles. What do you think is going on there, I guess, with that? Is that like the circle, the karma, like the karmic circle, right? Like the kind of cycle of how what goes around comes around kind of thing? Is it as simple as that, or is there?
I mean, I'm thinking the karma as, a potential interpretation. I'm also thinking about all in circles, like EN circles. So like all encompassing, or like an active like wrapping around of this realization. So that kind of makes it more physical, right? Like if you think about someone being haunted in their dreams, right? They kind of have this oppressive like cloud over them of like this realization.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I guess maybe just to close off on, it might be said that I was a little bit, favorable to the book, or maybe a bit too kind.
Throw some contrast in there.
Yeah, I don't hate it. It's kind of boring to pick a celebrity poetry book and be like, oh, that's bad, But there were a couple moments where I definitely had to put it down and roll my eyes and things like that. And I think that one of them, and I feel like it won't be an uncommon experience here, was fatality. I feel like this is really exemplary of Instagram poetry. I haven't fleshed out my theory, but I do kind of refer to it as like divine feminine affirmation tweets. And that's kind of what they read like, right? It's just some kind of like quippy, like almost like a bumper sticker. Yeah, so I can, I guess, go into this one and we can maybe close off on it. You've been fighting me for 3 hours like we're in a game of Mortal Kombat. I start daydreaming of the look on your face when I tell you his dick was so much bigger than yours. Fatality. And I wrote stop in all caps over that because it did not hit.
This is an interesting, especially because the title's at the end. Like that's literally mirroring like the way the game goes. Where it ends with when one of them dies, or one of the players dies, right? It doesn't matter. Or no, only when you die.
If you land a fatality, you have to get like a really nice KO on someone and like rip their head off. I guess it seems corny to me, which is like the bane of my existence in poetry. Like when ending with fatality is like, okay, we know like everybody thinks that the meanest thing that you can tell a man is that someone else's penis was bigger, right?
That's the biggest blow to one's ego, which is also very much an embodied kind of attack.
Yes, very much so, very embodied. And I think like ending with fatality after that, I don't know, maybe she knew that she was being on the nose and kind of being ironic. But
that's true. There's something interesting about the ending. Now that I'm seeing this one, and like not all of them, but some of them, I think this goes with what you were saying about how they kind of have this sort of like reductive and also like super like condensed like bumper sticker style kind of evocations that like the end of the titles being at the end almost read like they could be tweets, and then the title at the end is like the hashtag that you put at the end of a tweet.
Yeah.
So it's like the whole thing, right? His dick was so much bigger than yours, hashtag fatality.
I'll have to check that hashtag and see if anybody's rolling with it.
Yeah, because I see that now that I'm just glancing at this one, which is super short, but it's your love leaves bloodstains on my bed sheets, and then it's giving Patrick.
That would totally work as a hashtag.
Hashtag Bateman, like, yeah, which also speaks to, I mean, Patrick Bateman, obviously it's a reference to American Psycho, but it speaks to some of the things you're talking about, like American culture and like American masculinity versus femininity and those kinds of like the representations of those, and also like the expressions of those, and how what's kind of considered, more mainstream in some ways to understand, and how we understand like femininity and masculinity. There's still like very mainstream approaches to the way those are kind of contextualized. Yeah.
And I think the embodiment or lack thereof, I guess, comes into play in the daydreaming, right? So she's kind of like in a different, like operating on a different plane, right? We have the you've been fighting me rather than we've been fighting. So we have like a one-sidedness there, and kind of the daydreaming is where they're gaining some sort of power, but it's still like just a fantasy.
Yeah. That's interesting you point that out, how, one party seems to be at least like, if not just defensive, then entirely passive, which in the context of like the video game makes me think of like, when you're just fighting like an NPC character, NPC versus like, NPC opponent, versus like, playing someone who is, right, like you can do like a 2-player where it's like actually, 2 actual people playing. So there's something here where I guess in that sense, and then she's the one who starts daydreaming. It kind of sounds like, perhaps she's like sort of acting as the NPC kind of to fulfill like something for him, right? Like, she's just there to serve the purpose of, what, as an NPC does, which is just like someone who, not even like in the sense of like when people use that in real life to like, belittle someone, but literally in a game, right? It's just like usually a character that is there to serve some greater purpose and has a very small role in and of themselves.
That's Megan Fox is the NPC. I think that's the tagline.
I think so. Yeah, that'll be the tagline of the episode. Yeah, really interesting. I think like interpretations and critiques of this poetry book, which did not come to light for me at first, but there were certain poems that definitely spoke to me as well, in the sense of like, I was like, oh, this is not bad. Yeah. And I think that, I don't know if that's like the main takeaway. What do you think? Is it the takeaway to just be like, let's at least give these kinds of productions from like celebrities, right? Like the time of day? Or, is it kind of just like we can and we could, but it doesn't really matter if we do.
I guess when I think about like bashing celebrity poetry, I think that a lot of it is rooted in judging the intention, right? Like we think that they enter into these things without a lot of care, which I mean, I don't think that I can prove or disprove. But I think that the end products, right? Like I think that there are Grossman kind of mentions the fact that when you're writing a poem, it's always both recursive and forward thinking, and the fact that you're speaking in language that was like invented prior to your birth, right? And in some ways, like language speaks for itself, right? When you exist in a society, you pick up turns of phrase and things like that. So you're always, speaking with more gravity than you might be aware of. So even though, Megan Fox might not be like a lifelong poet and might not be the most invested in producing a great work of poetry, sometimes these things just happen because you exist in, linguistic sphere, and these, these things come out of you.
Right. So it's not just about like, this being like the final production of what she had, or what she produces. It's not the final production, but it's also speaking to how like her language is also being produced, right? Like by, like you're saying, like by this kind of like sphere of...
So I guess it's not just Megan Fox that's writing, right? She's speaking, in totality, like with all of the people that she's met, with all of the movies that she's watched, things like that. So, we might judge Megan Fox as a celebrity, but she's bringing a lot more to the table than just herself.
Yeah, I really like that interpretation. Yeah, that reading. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we are out of time. So thank you so much, Briel, for bringing this text that I probably would never have read, or I mean, I hadn't even heard of it. So thank you for bringing that to the table for us today. And yeah, it was great having you on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we'll see you next time.